The trail camera footage showed something moving on two legs through my property at 3:47 a.m. The thermal signature was 7 feet tall and moved with a gait that made my hands shake when I reviewed it. What appeared on that SD card shouldn't exist, but the claw marks on my cabin door the next morning proved otherwise. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I bought the property in northern Michigan 3 years ago. 40 acres of dense forest backed up against state land that stretched for miles. The cabin was small but solid, built in the 70s by a logger who'd worked these woods his whole life. I wanted isolation after 20 years as a Detroit homicide detective, somewhere the only sounds were wind and wildlife. The isolation suited me perfectly after 2 decades of working homicides. I'd seen enough violence and death to last several lifetimes, enough crime scenes and body bags to fill my nightmares for years. The cabin offered peace, or at least the promise of it. The nearest town was Kalkaska, population 2,000, 18 miles down a county road that turned to gravel after the first 5 miles. The property itself was pristine wilderness, the kind that developers hadn't touched because the terrain was too rough. Ancient white pines towered over a mixed hardwood forest of maple, oak, and birch. The understory was thick with ferns and brush, creating natural corridors where wildlife moved. A creek ran through the western section, cold and clear, fed by springs that never ran dry. The real estate agent mentioned that hunters avoided the back section of the property, said the deer didn't run there anymore. She said it casually, like it was just a quirk of the land, but I should have paid more attention. I figured it just meant less noise during rifle season, fewer orange vests tramping through my woods. I was wrong about that, as I was wrong about many things regarding those 40 acres. I installed 6 trail cameras around the property within the first month, mostly to catalog what lived out there and to keep an eye on things when I drove back to the city for supplies. The cameras were good ones, military-grade thermal imaging with motion sensors that could pick up a mouse at 50 yards. I'd spent $2,000 on equipment that could capture crystal-clear images day or night. I mounted them on trees at chest height, angled to cover game trails and the approaches to the cabin. The cameras became my window into the nocturnal world of the forest. During the day, I could see deer browsing and turkeys scratching in the leaves. At night, the thermal imaging revealed a completely different ecosystem. The first 2 months gave me exactly what I expected. White-tailed deer moving through in small groups, a black bear that passed through in early fall, coyotes hunting along the creek, raccoons investigating everything with their nimble paws, and one bobcat that prowled past camera 3 on a Tuesday morning. I cataloged every species methodically, keeping a journal with timestamps and behavior notes. It was a habit from my detective days, documenting everything, looking for patterns. The deer were most active at dawn and dusk, moving between feeding areas with practiced caution. The coyotes preferred the hours just after dark and just before dawn, their hunts timed to catch prey at their most vulnerable. The bear moved through in early September, probably heading toward a denning site for winter. Everything followed predictable patterns, natural rhythms that had been established over thousands of years. The wildlife moved through established trails, behaved according to their species' instincts, and avoided areas where predators marked territory. It was textbook wilderness behavior, exactly what you'd expect from undisturbed forest, until late October, when those patterns began to break down in ways that made no sense. The anomalies started on October 23rd. Camera 4, positioned on the northwest trail about 200 yards from the cabin, began triggering at odd hours with nothing visible in the frame. Just empty trail, trees, and darkness captured in thermal imaging. The motion sensor was calibrated to pick up anything larger than a rabbit, and yet frame after frame showed nothing but static forest. I checked the mounting, thinking maybe I'd positioned it poorly and wind was swaying branches into the sensor range. I replaced the batteries even though they showed 3/4 charge, repositioned the camera twice, and even tested it by walking past at various angles to ensure the motion sensor was working correctly. It functioned perfectly during my tests, triggering exactly when it should, but the false triggers continued every night, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., that dead period when most wildlife is bedded down. and even predators take a rest. Then camera 6, the one covering the clearing behind the cabin, started doing the same thing. Camera 6 was positioned to watch the area where I stored firewood and kept the generator shed. It was a vulnerable approach to the cabin, and I'd placed the camera specifically to catch anyone or anything that might investigate the structures. Now it was triggering multiple times per night with empty frames, always during that same 2-hour window. I pulled the SD cards and reviewed every single frame on my laptop, zooming in on sections, adjusting brightness and contrast, looking for any explanation. The more I reviewed, the less sense it made. The cameras were top-tier equipment, the kind used by wildlife biologists and military surveillance. They didn't give false triggers except in extreme conditions like heavy snow or dense fog, neither of which explained what was happening. The nights were clear and cold, perfect conditions for thermal imaging, and yet something was triggering the motion sensors without appearing in frame, something that could set off the detector but leave no visible heat signature. I spent a week reviewing every frame from both cameras, documenting each anomaly in my journal. What I found made me question the equipment despite its reputation. There were shadows that moved wrong, dark shapes at the edge of frames that appeared in one image and vanished in the next without crossing the field of view. In normal vision mode, I saw branches that seemed to shift position between frames taken seconds apart. In thermal mode, I caught heat signatures that didn't match any animal I'd cataloged. These signatures were puzzling because they were too tall for a bear on all fours, too narrow for a bear standing upright, and moving through terrain that should have slowed anything down to a careful walk. Bears lumber through undergrowth, breaking branches and disturbing the ground cover. Deer bound through in careful leaps, landing lightly and moving quickly. Coyotes slink low, using natural cover. Whatever these signatures belonged to moved differently, with a stride that suggested bipedal locomotion, and a path that showed no deviation for obstacles. On November 3rd, Camera 4 captured something that made me drive into town the next morning and buy 3 more cameras, these ones with even higher resolution and longer battery life. I spent another $1,500 on equipment, maxing out my credit card, because what I'd seen on that SD card demanded better documentation. The footage showed a figure moving through the frame at 3:22 a.m., captured in both thermal and low-light visible spectrum. The figure was bipedal, moving on 2 legs with a confident stride that spoke of familiarity with the terrain. It was covered in dark fur that showed clearly in the visible light mode, a coat so thick it looked almost shaggy in places. The head shape was wrong for a bear, elongated and forward-facing rather than rounded. The thermal signature showed it was warm-blooded, definitely mammalian, and 7 feet tall at minimum when I measured against the marked tree in the background. The creature moved through the undergrowth without breaking stride, stepping over fallen logs and ducking under low branches with practiced ease. The gait was purposeful, almost human in its rhythm, but the proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms hung past where knees would be, suggesting reach that would span 7 or 8 feet. The head sat forward on the shoulders with no visible neck, creating a profile that reminded me of wolves or large dogs. The legs bent backward at what should have been the ankle, digitigrade locomotion like a dog or wolf runs on its toes. I froze the frame at the clearest point and measured proportions against the trees. The arms hung to mid-thigh in human terms, impossibly long for any primate. The torso was barrel-chested, suggesting lung capacity and muscle mass that would support prolonged running or climbing. The legs were proportionately shorter than human legs, but powerfully built, with obvious muscle definition visible even through the fur. This was a creature built for strength and endurance, a predator designed for hunting in dense forest. I'd seen bears stand and walk on 2 legs during my time in the woods. This wasn't that. Bears lumber and sway, their weight shifting awkwardly from side to side as they struggle with bipedal movement that isn't natural for them. They stand to get a better view or reach something high, but they don't travel that way. This thing strode with confidence, weight shifting smoothly from foot to foot, arms swinging slightly for balance, head swiveling to scan the area as it moved. It was comfortable on two legs in a way that suggested it was this creature's natural method of travel. When the Dogman turned its head to look directly at the camera, I felt my stomach drop. The eye shine reflecting back was too high and too wide set for any animal I knew. The eyes caught the camera's flash and reflected it back in that characteristic green glow that nocturnal predators have, the tapetum lucidum that allows night vision. But the placement was wrong, set forward in the skull like a primate or predator that needed binocular vision for hunting, not placed on the sides like prey animals that needed panoramic vision for detecting threats. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the cabin with my service weapon on the table, a Glock 9mm that I'd carried for 18 years on the job. Every light was off so I could watch the tree line through the windows without being backlit. I knew from my police training that sitting in a lit room at night makes you blind to anything outside, turns the windows into mirrors that only show your own reflection. So I sat in darkness and watched the forest, looking for movement, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Nothing came. The forest was silent in that unnatural way that happens when predators are near. No owl calls, no rustle of mice in the leaves, no distant coyote howls. Just silence and the wind moving through the pines, creating that soft rushing sound that could mask the approach of anything quiet enough to move carefully. At dawn, when the first gray light began to filter through the trees, I finally relaxed enough to brew coffee and plan my next move. I walked out to camera 4 as the sun cleared the horizon, bringing my rifle this time, a .308 Winchester that I'd bought for deer hunting but never actually fired except at the range. The walk was 200 yards through fairly open forest, and I covered it carefully, checking my surroundings every few steps, listening for anything that might be following. The forest was coming alive with bird calls, the normal sounds returning as if someone had flipped a switch when the sun rose. I found the camera untouched, still mounted securely on the tree, battery indicator showing good charge. I checked the area where the figure had been walking, looking for any sign of its passage. The ground was hard from early frost, the kind of cold that sets in during late October nights and makes tracking difficult. But near the creek, where moisture kept the earth soft, I found something that made my hands start to shake. The tracks were unlike anything in my experience as a hunter or detective. They were elongated impressions in the mud, showing 5 toes instead of 4, each toe tipped with a claw mark that had sunk deep into the soft earth. The print itself measured 16 inches from heel to longest claw, nearly twice the size of a large bear track. The depth of the impression suggested significant weight, easily 300 or 400 pounds pressing down with each step. What made the tracks impossible to explain away was the shape. They were canid, clearly from something related to dogs or wolves, but the scale was wrong by a factor of 3. A gray wolf, the largest wild canid in North America, leaves tracks around 5 inches long. These were 16 inches. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet, suggesting legs much longer than any wolf possessed. And the tracks showed bipedal walking, not the 4-footed gait of any normal canine. I made plaster casts of 3 prints, using materials I'd kept from my police days when documenting evidence. I mixed the plaster carefully, poured it into the impressions, and waited for it to set while guarding the area from any disturbance. The cast took 2 hours to cure properly in the cold morning air. While I waited, I photographed everything from multiple angles, used a tape measure to document dimensions, and sketched the track pattern in my journal. I spent the next 6 hours online, searching for any explanation that would make sense of what I'd found. Bear tracks in mud can look elongated when the animal slips or the substrate is wrong. Camera glitches can create artifacts that look like figures. Pareidolia makes us see patterns that aren't there, faces in clouds and animals in shadows. I wanted these explanations to stick desperately, wanted to find some rational interpretation that would let me sleep at night. But the footage and the tracks wouldn't allow it. I'd worked crime scenes for 2 decades, learned to analyze evidence objectively and follow where it led regardless of personal comfort. I knew chain of custody, knew how to document findings, knew the difference between real evidence and contamination or misinterpretation. This evidence was solid. The camera had captured something real. The tracks were authentic impressions in undisturbed mud, and both pieces of evidence pointed to the same impossible conclusion. The search results gave me a term I'd heard before but never taken seriously: Dogman. Stories from Michigan about bipedal canine creatures, sightings going back decades, witness reports from hunters and campers and park rangers. Most were dismissed as misidentifications or hoaxes, the kind of cryptid nonsense that clutters the internet alongside Bigfoot and lake monsters. But the descriptions matched what I'd captured on camera. 7 to 8 feet tall, fur-covered, wolf-like head, walking upright, moving through forests with unnatural confidence. The Michigan Dogman legend was specific to the northern Lower Peninsula and the Upper Peninsula, areas of dense forest with low human populations. Reports clustered around years ending in 7 for reasons no one could explain, some kind of cycle that witnesses claimed to have observed over generations. 1987, 1997, 2007, and now approaching 2017. The skeptic in me dismissed the pattern as confirmation bias, people seeing what they expected to see during specific years. But the detective in me noted the consistency of details across independent witnesses separated by decades. The new cameras arrived on November 8th, shipped overnight at extra cost because I couldn't wait 3 days for standard delivery. I installed them in a perimeter around the cabin, overlapping fields of view so nothing could approach without triggering at least 2 cameras. I used better mounting brackets, positioned them higher in the trees to get wider coverage, and set the sensitivity to maximum. I added motion sensor lights on the cabin itself, bright LED floods that would activate with any movement within 30 feet. I kept the generator running at night so I'd have power for the floodlights if needed. The noise bothered me because it meant I couldn't hear approaching threats as easily, but the lights were worth the trade-off. I also installed simple early warning systems that I'd learned from my time on the police force. Fishing lines strung at ankle height around the cabin perimeter, tied to bells that would ring if anything tripped them. It was low-tech but effective, especially for detecting approaches that the cameras might miss. The first week with the new camera setup was quiet, too quiet. The regular wildlife that had been constant on the footage disappeared entirely. No deer moving through at dawn, no coyotes hunting along the creek at dusk, not even raccoons raiding the garbage or opossums waddling across the clearing. Just empty forest and the occasional bird. Mostly crows that seemed to be watching the property with unusual interest. The absence of normal wildlife was more disturbing than the strange footage had been. In my police work, I'd learned that absence of evidence can itself be evidence of something wrong. When witnesses suddenly clam up, when informants go silent, when normal patterns of behavior stop, it usually means something has changed in the environment. Fear drives behavior more than any other factor. The wildlife was afraid, avoiding my property like they knew something I didn't. Predators create fear responses, but normal predators don't clear out an entire ecosystem. Bears and wolves coexist with deer and smaller animals because prey have to eat despite danger. This was different. This was everything staying away. Camera 3 caught the Dogman on November 15th at 2:14 a.m., and the footage was dramatically better with the new equipment. The creature moved along the eastern property line in perfect profile, and the high-resolution thermal imaging revealed details that confirmed my worst fears. The muscle definition in the shoulders and arms suggested strength far beyond human capability, bunched masses of tissue that would allow this thing to tear apart trees or overpower any prey it caught. The barrel chest expanded and contracted with breathing, creating vapor clouds in the cold air that the thermal camera captured as brief blooms of heat. The Dogman's head turned as it walked, scanning the forest with methodical attention, and I could see the ears move independently, swiveling to catch sounds from different directions. The muzzle was elongated like a wolf's, but larger and more robust, suggesting jaw muscles capable of delivering crushing bite force. It stopped once during its passage across the camera's field of view, lowering its head to sniff the ground near a game trail. The posture was pure canine, the body language of a dog or wolf investigating a scent, but the size was wrong, impossibly wrong, as this creature stood 7 feet tall even in a crouch. After a few seconds of investigation, The Dogman raised its head, looked directly at the cabin despite the darkness and distance, and then continued moving toward my property. Camera 2 picked up the Dogman 8 minutes later, now only 100 yards from the cabin. The creature had stopped moving. The thermal signature showed it standing completely still on the trail, head tilted slightly, oriented toward the cabin, just standing there, watching. The posture was relaxed, weight balanced evenly on both feet, arms hanging at its sides. There was no sign of aggression or excitement in the body language. It was simply observing, studying, learning about the structures and the occupant. I was inside at that exact moment, sitting at the kitchen table reviewing the previous night's footage on my laptop. I felt it then, that primitive instinct that prey animals have when they're being watched by a predator. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My peripheral vision seemed to sharpen, and my heart rate increased without conscious thought. I looked up from the laptop and scanned the windows, but saw nothing beyond the reach of the porch light, just darkness and the vague shapes of trees. The footage showed the Dogman standing there for 11 minutes and 42 seconds. I counted every second when I reviewed it the next morning, watching the timestamp advance while the thermal signature remained motionless. 11 minutes of observation, of assessment of whatever thoughts went through that creature's mind. Then it turned, with fluid grace, and walked away, not back the way it had come, but straight into the densest part of the forest, where the undergrowth was so thick I'd never managed to push through it. The thermal signature showed the Dogman moving through that barrier like it wasn't there, branches that should have blocked a bear or a man offering no resistance to this thing's passage. It simply walked forward and the forest seemed to open up. Or perhaps the Dogman knew paths through the dense growth that no human could see. Within seconds, the thermal signature faded into the background heat of the forest, and the creature was gone. I spent November 16th reinforcing the cabin. I installed deadbolts on both doors, heavy-duty steel that would require serious force to break through. I added metal strike plates to the door frames, extending the screws into the wall studs so the frame itself would have to fail before the door could be forced. I moved my bed away from the windows to a position where I had clear line of sight to both doors, but couldn't be seen from outside. I boarded up one window that was too vulnerable, accepting the loss of natural light in exchange for security. I cleaned both my firearms thoroughly, breaking down the Glock and the rifle completely, checking every component, replacing springs that might be weakened by age. I oiled all moving parts, tested the actions dozens of times, and loaded fresh ammunition that I'd been saving for emergencies. The .308 rounds were 165 grain soft points designed for deer, and I had 40 rounds total. The Glock held 17 rounds of 9mm hollow points in the magazine plus one in the chamber, and I had 3 spare magazines. I made sure I had clear shooting lanes from the bed to both doors, moved furniture that might provide cover for anything that broke in, and stacked supplies where I could access them quickly. Water, food, first aid kit, flashlights, batteries, and a battery-powered radio in case cell service failed. I was preparing like I would for a siege, using tactics I'd learned during SWAT training years ago. The cabin became a defensive position rather than a home. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was overreacting to wildlife footage and my own imagination. But I'd learned to trust my instincts over 20 years of police work, and my instincts said this was different. Normal animals don't study human dwellings for 11 minutes. Normal animals don't move through impossible terrain. Normal animals don't clear out entire ecosystems with their presence. Whatever was out there wasn't normal, and pretending otherwise could get me killed. The attacks on the trail cameras started on November 17th. Camera 5, positioned on the southern approach trail, went offline at 1:43 a.m. The SD card stopped recording. The wireless signal that transmitted preview images to my laptop died, and the device became completely unresponsive. When I hiked out the next morning to check it, I found the camera torn from the tree and lying smashed on the ground 20 feet away. The mounting bracket was bent into a U-shape, metal that should have taken hundreds of pounds of force to deform. The camera itself was destroyed thoroughly. The casing was crushed, the lens shattered, the circuit board inside broken into pieces, but the SD card, protected in its metal slot, survived intact. I pulled it from the wreckage and reviewed the footage on my laptop back at the cabin. The last image was clear despite the violence that followed. It showed a massive clawed hand reaching toward the lens, fur dark and coarse, each claw easily 4 inches long and curved like the talons of a raptor. The hand filled most of the frame, blocking out the forest behind it. The palm was broad and padded like a dog's paw, but the digits were longer and more dexterous than any canine should possess. The claws were dark, almost black, and came to needle points that could tear through hide or flesh with minimal effort. The scale was wrong, suggesting a hand twice the size of the largest human hand, attached to an arm that would be proportionally massive. Camera 7 went offline 2 nights later in the same manner. The device was torn from its mounting and destroyed with focused violence. When I retrieved the SD card, the final image showed the Dogman's face filling the frame at a distance of perhaps 2 feet. The mouth was slightly open, showing teeth that made my blood run cold. The canines were at least 3 inches long, visible even with the jaws barely parted, designed for gripping and tearing rather than crushing like bear teeth. The jaw structure suggested bite force that could crush bone easily. The muscles visible along the side of the head, the masseter muscles that power the bite, were enormously developed. The skull was shaped to anchor those muscles, creating a head that looked disproportionately large compared to even the massive body. These were adaptations for taking down large prey, modifications that evolution had honed over millennia for killing efficiently. But it was the eyes that kept me awake. They were positioned forward in the skull like a predator's eyes, providing binocular vision for judging distance when hunting. The color in the thermal image was impossible to determine, but the structure was clear. Large eyes with excellent night vision, probably able to see in near darkness, and behind those eyes was intelligence. Not the simple cunning of a wolf tracking prey, but awareness and calculation. The Dogman knew what the cameras were and was systematically destroying them. I called the county sheriff's department on November 20th. Deputy Miller had been friendly when I'd met him at the hardware store in town, and he seemed like someone who might take me seriously. I was wrong about that. I showed him the footage on my laptop, walking him through the timeline from the first strange captures to the Dogman footage to the destroyed cameras. I showed him the plaster casts of the tracks and my detailed documentation. Miller watched everything in silence. His face remained carefully neutral, the expression I'd worn 1,000 times when taking statements from witnesses whose stories didn't make sense. When I finished the presentation, he asked if I'd been drinking. I told him I was stone sober and had 20 years of law enforcement experience, that I knew evidence when I saw it. He suggested I call the Department of Natural Resources about bear activity in the area, said they had specialists who could help with wildlife problems. Then he left without filing a report. I didn't blame him. If someone had shown me this footage before I'd experienced it myself, I would have assumed mental health issues or an elaborate hoax. Physical evidence can be faked, video can be manipulated, and even trained observers can misinterpret what they see. Miller had no reason to believe me, and every reason to think I was wasting his time with nonsense. But it still stung to be dismissed so easily, to have my professional courtesy ignored. By late November, I had 3 functioning cameras left out of the original 9. The Dogman had destroyed 6 cameras over the course of 2 weeks, always at night, always leaving one clear frame showing its approach before the device went dark. It was learning the camera positions faster than I could relocate them, tracking them through methods I couldn't understand. I moved the remaining cameras daily, choosing new positions each morning, trying to stay unpredictable. Nothing worked. The Dogman found them anyway. Camera 9 lasted 2 nights in its new position before I saw the familiar pattern. Footage of the creature approaching through the trees, moving with purpose, reaching out toward the lens. Then the signal died and the SD card stopped recording. I retrieved it the next morning to find the camera smashed, the housing split open, the electronics scattered across the ground. The Dogman was learning, adapting, and hunting my equipment with focused determination. The scratching on the cabin started on November 24th. I woke at 3:15 a.m. to a sound that cut through my dreams and brought me instantly alert. Claws dragging across wood, slow and deliberate, the sound of something very sharp carving through the back door. I grabbed the rifle from beside the bed and moved to the kitchen, keeping the wall between me and the door, approaching from an angle that wouldn't expose me if the door failed. The scratching continued for 5 minutes, long deliberate gouges being carved into the wood, starting at the top of the door and working down. I could hear the pressure in the sound, the force being applied, wood fibers tearing as claws pulled through them like they were soft clay. The door was solid oak, 2 inches thick, and whatever was outside was shredding it without apparent effort. Then silence fell, absolute and sudden, more frightening than the noise had been. I waited 30 minutes before moving, rifle aimed at the door, safety off, finger resting beside the trigger guard. No sound came from outside, no breathing, no footsteps, no indication anything was still there. Finally, I approached the door and examined it in the beam of my flashlight. 4 parallel scratches ran from top to bottom, each one 2 inches deep, cutting through the wood grain like it was balsa. The spacing between scratches suggested claws on a single hand, and the length suggested that hand had been at least a foot wide. I tried to leave the next morning. The decision came at dawn when I admitted that I was trapped and outmatched, that pride and stubbornness were no substitute for survival instinct. My truck was parked in the clearing 30 yards from the cabin, a Ford F-150 that had never failed me in 3 years of ownership. I grabbed my essential supplies, my documentation, the SD cards from the destroyed cameras, and headed for the truck at a fast walk. The tires had been shredded, all 4 of them, the sidewalls torn open by something with immense strength, rubber and steel belts ripped apart like tissue paper. Each tire had multiple tears, suggesting repeated strikes from claws or teeth. The hood was dented where something had struck it from above. The metal crumpled inward, creating a depression 8 inches deep. The windshield had a star pattern crack that spread across the entire pane, the impact point suggesting something had been dropped or had jumped onto the glass. My keys were still in my pocket. The truck hadn't been stolen or vandalized randomly. This was deliberate destruction, targeted sabotage to remove my ability to leave. The truck was undrivable, the tires shredded beyond any hope of repair, and the nearest help was 18 miles away down a road I couldn't walk in a single day. I was trapped, 40 acres of forest between me and civilization, with something that wanted me to stay. The message was clear. The Dogman controlled this territory, and I was here at its sufferance. I returned to the cabin and began preparing for a siege. If I couldn't leave, I would defend what I had. I gathered every tool that could serve as a weapon, a hatchet, a hunting knife, a crowbar that could break bone if swung hard enough. I brought all my remaining water containers inside and filled them from the pump. I packed all the food into the cabin and inventoried it carefully. 10 days of supplies if I rationed carefully. Maybe 2 weeks if I stretched it thin. Camera 1, my last functioning camera near the cabin, captured everything that happened on November 26th. The footage began at 2:47 a.m. with the Dogman approaching from the tree line. It moved in a crouch that kept its head below the lower branches, demonstrating flexibility that seemed impossible for something so large. The creature stopped at the edge of the clearing, 20 feet from the camera, and sat back on its haunches like a dog waiting for a command. The thermal imaging showed heat radiating from its body in waves. The temperature difference suggested a metabolism running hot, burning energy fast, maintaining activity in the November cold that should have sent bears into hibernation. The Dogman's breath misted in the air, each exhalation creating a cloud that dissipated slowly. Its mouth hung slightly open, tongue visible, panting lightly. It was watching the cabin with that same patient observation I'd seen before, studying, learning, waiting for the right moment. At 3:12 a.m., the Dogman stood and approached the cabin. The footage showed it moving around the structure with methodical precision, checking windows and doors, testing them with increasing force. Its movements were careful and controlled, each touch deliberate, gathering information about the cabin's weaknesses. When it reached the back door, the one with the scratches from the previous night, it placed both hands on the frame and pulled. The door frame groaned under the pressure. I heard it inside the cabin, a creaking protest from wood and nails stressed beyond their design limits. The Dogman pulled steadily, testing the strength of the installation, finding the limits of what the structure could withstand. The frame held, the deadbolt I'd installed doing its job, the metal strike plates distributing force into the studs. But it was close. The wood flexed visibly, and I knew another minute of steady pressure would tear the whole assembly loose. The Dogman stepped back, tilted its head in that characteristic canine gesture of curiosity, and then hit the door with its shoulder. The impact sounded like a truck collision, a boom that shook the entire cabin and knocked pictures off the walls. I was pressed against the interior wall with the rifle aimed at the door, waiting for it to explode inward, knowing I'd get maybe 2 shots before the Dogman was on me. The door held, the frame cracking but not failing, the deadbolt straining but not breaking. The Dogman circled the cabin twice more. Camera 1's coverage ended at the eastern corner, but the audio continued to record. I could hear footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving around the structure. I could hear the Dogman testing windows, tapping on glass, applying pressure to frames. Then I heard it stop near the front of the cabin, where my bedroom window faced the clearing. The sound that came next made every hair on my body stand up. The Dogman was breathing through the glass. I could hear it in the cabin, a wet snuffling sound like a dog investigating a new scent, magnified 100 times in volume. The window was single pane, old glass from when the cabin was built, and I watched it flex slightly with each breath. The Dogman's nose was pressed against the glass, its breath fogging the pane, its attention focused on finding me inside. I had moved silently across the room earlier, pressing myself into the corner where the window's angle wouldn't show me to anything looking straight in. I stood there frozen, barely breathing, watching the window without being visible to the creature outside. The Dogman's hand came into view, massive and clawed, pressing against the glass. The claws tapped lightly, an almost gentle percussion that was more terrifying than violence would have been. The glass flexed but didn't break. The window held under that terrible pressure, modern materials doing what the manufacturer promised. After 2 minutes that felt like hours, the hand withdrew. I heard the Dogman step back from the window, heard it move away around the side of the cabin. I didn't move from my corner, didn't relax my position because I knew this wasn't over. It was learning the cabin's construction, finding the weak points, planning its eventual entry. Camera 1's final footage showed the Dogman standing in the clearing at 3:28 a.m., facing the camera directly. It approached slowly, closing the distance from 20 feet to 5 feet to 3 feet. The detail was extraordinary in the high-resolution thermal imaging. I could see the individual hairs in its fur, the scars that marked its hide, the old wounds that had healed into thick ridges. This was an animal that had fought and survived, that carried the marks of battles won. Then the Dogman reached out with one hand, almost gently, and gripped the camera. The claws wrapped around the housing, the pressure increasing slowly until the plastic began to crack. The lens distorted as the housing compressed, the image warping. Then the camera died, crushed completely, the last frame showing that massive hand closing like a vice. The SD card ejected during the destruction, designed to pop free under shock, and I found it in the leaves the next morning when I searched the area. November 27th was spent in preparation. I had no cameras left, no vehicle, and no way to call for help since cell service didn't reach the property, and my satellite phone had been in the truck when the tires were destroyed. The nearest neighbor was 4 miles through dense forest. I could walk it during the day, but the journey would take at least 2 hours through terrain that offered plenty of ambush points, and I knew the Dogman owned the night, that I wouldn't survive in the open after dark. I reinforced the cabin doors with every piece of wood I could find. I pulled boards from the bed frame, from the closet shelving, from anywhere they weren't structural. I nailed them across the doors in diagonal braces, creating a lattice that would resist impact better than the original construction. I piled furniture behind the doors as additional barriers, heavy pieces that would slow any forced entry. I filled every container I had with water from the pump and moved all my food into the main room. I cleared the main room of everything except essentials, creating open space where I could move and shoot without furniture blocking my line of fire. I positioned the rifle where I could grab it instantly, fully loaded with a round in the chamber. The Glock went into a belt holster that I wore even inside the cabin. I slept during the day when sunlight made the forest feel almost safe, and I stayed awake at night with the rifle across my lap, watching the darkness through windows I'd partially boarded. The Dogman came every night, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. I could hear it circling the cabin, testing doors and windows, sometimes scratching at the walls, sometimes hitting the structure hard enough to shake the floor. The attacks were methodical, systematic, learning what would break and what would hold. On November 28th, it hit the back door so hard that the frame split at the top corner. Wood cracked with a sound like a gunshot, and I saw the door frame separate from the wall by half an inch. I moved to the kitchen with the rifle, aimed at the door, and fired a shot through the wood. I aimed low, hoping to hit legs or body, trying to wound rather than kill if possible. The .308 round punched through the oak door like it was paper, the bullet traveling at nearly 3,000 feet per second. The recoil slammed into my shoulder, and the muzzle blast in the enclosed space made my ears ring despite the protection I was wearing. The Dogman screamed. The sound was unlike anything I'd heard from any animal in 20 years of hunting and police work. It started as a deep growl that I felt in my chest more than heard, a subsonic rumble that rattled the dishes in the cupboard. Then it rose to a howl that pierced through the walls and seemed to shake the air itself. The howl carried rage and pain combined, fury at being wounded, a promise of retribution that made my hands shake. Then silence fell, complete, absolute silence. No footsteps, no breathing, no sound of retreat. I waited by the door with the rifle ready, expecting the Dogman to tear through the weakened frame in a rage. Nothing came. I stood there for an hour, muscles cramping, sweat running down my back, despite the cold, waiting for an attack that didn't materialize. At dawn, I checked outside. There was blood on the porch, dark and thick, and a trail of drops leading into the forest. The blood confirmed what I'd suspected. The Dogman was flesh and blood, not some supernatural entity. It could be hurt, which meant it could potentially be killed. Whether the wound was serious or just superficial, I couldn't tell from the blood trail. But I'd drawn blood, and that changed everything. I'd gone from prey to something with teeth, something that could fight back. The question was whether that would make the Dogman reconsider its interest in me or simply make it more determined to eliminate a threat. The Dogman didn't come that night, or the next. By December 2nd, I started to hope it had left. Maybe to die from the wound, maybe to hunt easier prey, maybe just because I was too much trouble. I was wrong. On December 3rd, just after sunset when the sky was still showing color in the west, I heard howling from multiple directions. Not one Dogman, but several, calling to each other across my property. The calls came from the north, the east, the south. They were coordinating. I could tell from the pattern, the way one howl would start and then be answered by others, the spacing suggesting communication rather than random vocalization. These calls weren't like wolf howls, which are melodic and sustained. These were shorter, sharper, more complex in their pitch variations. They were talking, sharing information, planning something that required multiple participants. The Dogman I'd wounded had brought others, and now they were coming to finish what had started. I made my final stand preparations in the main room. I positioned furniture to create firing positions, places where I could take cover and still have clear shots at the doors and remaining windows. I laid out all my ammunition within easy reach. 40 rounds of .308 for the rifle, 72 rounds of 9mm for the Glock. I had two rifles actually, the .308 and an old .30-30 lever action that had belonged to the cabin's previous owner. I loaded that as well, giving me 3 firearms and enough ammunition for a sustained firefight. The first Dogman hit the front door at 8:47 p.m. before full darkness had even fallen. It came fast and hard, using speed and momentum rather than the careful testing of previous nights. The door exploded inward, the reinforcements I'd installed splintering like kindling, the deadbolt tearing through the frame, furniture scattering as the door's momentum pushed everything aside. The Dogman ducked through the doorway, massive and terrible, fur dark as midnight, eyes catching the lamplight and reflecting it back. I fired twice with the .308, both shots hitting center mass. The rifle's recoil was savage, and the shots were close enough together that they sounded almost like one long bang. Both bullets struck the Dogman in the chest, creating visible impacts that rocked it backward. But it didn't go down. It staggered, regained its footing, and then lunged toward me with speed that shouldn't have been possible for something wounded. I dove aside, abandoning the rifle for the moment, rolling behind the overturned couch. The Dogman crashed into the wall where I'd been standing, hitting with enough force to crack the plaster and shake the entire cabin. It recovered instantly, turning with fluid grace despite the wounds, tracking my movement. I fired again with the .308, this shot hitting its shoulder and creating a spray of blood that patterned the wall. The Dogman roared, a sound that made my teeth ache, but it kept coming. I dropped the rifle and pulled the Glock, firing as fast as I could pull the trigger. The 9mm rounds hit repeatedly. 6 shots, 7, 8, punching holes in the Dogman's torso and arms. Blood flew with each impact, but the creature didn't stop. It cleared the couch in a leap that showed impossible athleticism, landing in front of me with claws extended. I emptied the Glock's magazine into it at point-blank range, the muzzle flashes lighting up the room like strobes. The Dogman's momentum carried it forward despite the wounds, and it crashed into me before collapsing. We went down together, the Dogman's weight crushing me against the floor. It tried to claw me even as it died, raking my chest with one massive hand. The claws tore through my shirt and drew blood, 4 parallel lines of fire across my ribs. Then its strength failed, and the arm dropped. I struggled out from under the body, grabbed the 30-30 lever action, and put my back against the wall. The room was filled with smoke from the gunshots, and the smell of blood and gunpowder was overwhelming. The second Dogman came through the window, glass and frame shattering as it dove into the room. It was smaller than the first, maybe 6.5 feet tall, but faster. I got one shot off with the 30-30 that went wide before it was on me. Claws raked across my arm, tearing through my jacket and into flesh. I jammed the rifle barrel under its jaw and worked the lever action, firing point blank. The shot blew out the back of the Dogman's skull and it dropped instantly. 2 Dogman bodies lay in the wreckage of my cabin, and I could hear at least 2 more outside, circling. Blood ran down my arm from the claw wounds, soaking my sleeve. My chest burned where the first Dogman had torn through my shirt. I was wounded, running low on ammunition, and the cabin's defenses were completely breached. The front door was gone, the window destroyed, and I had nowhere to retreat. I grabbed my pistol and reloaded with shaking hands, dropped the magazine and fumbled a fresh one into place. The circling outside stopped. I heard them dragging something, the sound of great weight being pulled across the ground. They were retrieving the bodies, pulling them out through the door and window I'd used. The sounds continued for several minutes, branches breaking as they hauled the dead Dogman into the forest. Then silence fell again, that deep quiet that was more frightening than any sound. I stood in the ruins of my cabin with 2 firearms and waited for the next attack that didn't come. They'd retrieved their dead and left. I was alive, wounded but functional, standing in a destroyed cabin that looked like a war zone. Dawn on December 4th showed the full extent of the damage. The front door hung from one hinge, splintered and broken. The window was completely gone, just empty space where glass had been. Blood was everywhere. Walls, floor, furniture, my clothing. 2 sets of drag marks led from the cabin into the forest, trails through the leaves where the bodies had been pulled away. I waited until full daylight before moving, sitting against the wall with the Glock in one hand and the lever action rifle across my lap. When the sun was fully up and birds began calling in the forest, I finally relaxed enough to assess my wounds. The chest wounds were shallow, painful but not dangerous. 4 parallel cuts that would scar but hadn't hit anything vital. The arm was worse, a deeper gash that would need stitches. Blood still seeping despite the pressure I applied with a torn shirt. I gathered what supplies I could carry in a pack, moving carefully to avoid aggravating the wounds. The SD cards from the destroyed cameras went into a waterproof case. My documentation, my journals, the plaster casts of the footprints, all of it went into the pack. I took the Glock and all remaining ammunition. I left the rifles because I couldn't carry them and the pack both, not with my arm wounded. Then I started walking toward the nearest neighbor, 4 miles through forest that might still contain Dogman. The walk took 3 hours, moving slowly, stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. I heard nothing but normal forest sounds, birds and wind, and the occasional squirrel. The forest felt different in daylight, less oppressive, as if the Dogman presence lifted with the sun. I reached my neighbor's property just after noon, bleeding and exhausted. The elderly couple who lived there took one look at me and called 911. An ambulance arrived 40 minutes later, followed shortly by sheriff's deputies and the county sheriff himself. The investigation took weeks. Sheriff's deputies examined the cabin, documented the damage, collected blood samples from the walls and floor. They found the blood trails where the Dogman bodies had been dragged, followed them into the forest but found nothing. The bodies had been taken far away or hidden so thoroughly that even tracking dogs couldn't locate them. They found the destroyed trail cameras and the shredded truck tires and the claw marks on trees throughout the property. Deputy Miller was part of the investigation team. He didn't apologize for dismissing me earlier, but his face when he reviewed the trail camera footage said enough. The sheriff's department recovered all the SD cards I'd saved and reviewed every frame of footage. They saw the Dogman walking upright. They saw the attacks on the cameras. They saw the massive clawed hands. But the official report couldn't say Dogman or cryptid or unknown species. The official report listed the damage as a bear attack. Multiple bears, unusual aggression, possibly rabid, the report suggested. The Department of Natural Resources closed the section of state forest behind my property to hunting and camping. They posted warnings about dangerous wildlife, aggressive predators, recommending avoidance. They never used the word Dogman, never officially acknowledged what the evidence showed. But hunters in the area know the warnings are real, and nobody goes into those forests anymore, especially not after dark. I sold the property for a loss 6 months later, as soon as my injuries healed enough that I could handle the paperwork and meetings. A developer bought it for timber rights, said he'd clear-cut the whole 40 acres and sell the wood. I didn't tell him what lived in those forests, didn't warn him about the Dogman, let him find out on his own if he's foolish enough to send crews out there. I moved back to Detroit, back to the noise and the crowds and the constant human presence that suddenly felt safe. The authorities closed the case and sealed the files, but the truth is in those SD cards. 7 feet tall, walking upright, covered in dark fur, moving with intelligence and purpose through forests where deer no longer run. The trail camera captured the Dogman, and the Dogman destroyed the cameras. But the footage survived, and now you've seen what I saw. Now you know what's out there in the deep forests, watching from the darkness, waiting for foolish humans to wander into their territory. The next time you see those warning signs about dangerous wildlife, believe them. They're not talking about bears. For more interesting stories, check this out.